It began with a song. Not a command, not a gunshot, but a simple melody rising from the frozen trenches of Flanders. On a night when the world expected blood, men on both sides found something far rarer: peace. For one brief moment, the guns fell silent, and enemies became brothers. This is the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914, a miracle born in the mud and madness of war. By December 1914, Europe was drowning in blood. What had begun in August as a war of movement had frozen into a war of mud. The Western Front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a scar across the continent. Men who had once marched proudly under their nation's flags now lived like ghosts in ditches carved into the earth. The smell of decay clung to everything: the mud, the uniforms, the air itself. For weeks, rain had poured without mercy, turning the battlefield into a graveyard of flooded trenches, shattered trees, and mangled corpses. Christmas was approaching, but no one could feel it. In London, Berlin, and Paris, newspapers spoke of glory and sacrifice. But here, in Flanders, the soldiers spoke of rats, frostbite, and death. They had entered the war believing it would be over by Christmas. Now Christmas had arrived, and the war showed no sign of ending. The front lines near Ypres, Belgium, were typical of this new kind of warfare. The British Expeditionary Force faced the German army across a wasteland barely 100 yards wide. Between them lay a deadly no-man's land, strewn with wire, craters, and the bodies of those who had tried to cross it. Snipers watched constantly, and the whine of shells had become the rhythm of their existence. Yet even in this desolation, there were flickers of humanity. Letters arrived from home, filled with the smell of bread, candle wax, and comfort. Packages brought chocolate, tobacco, and small reminders that life still existed beyond the front. For many, these small tokens meant survival. And as December 24th drew near, they clung to one last hope: that for one day, the war might pause. That evening, as darkness fell over the shattered landscape, something strange began to happen. Along the German trenches, lights appeared, faint at first, then brighter. Tiny flames flickered along the parapets. Candles. The Germans had placed small Christmas trees, Tannenbaum, atop the mud walls of their trenches. And then, from across the line, came a sound that stopped the British soldiers in their tracks. Singing, soft, wavering, but unmistakable. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night. The men on the British side listened in disbelief. Their enemies, the same men who had shelled them that morning, were singing Christmas carols. When the song ended, a voice called out in heavily accented English, "English soldiers, Merry Christmas!" First there was silence. Then, from the British trenches, another voice answered, "Merry Christmas to you too." Laughter followed. And then, to everyone's amazement, the British began to sing back. Their carol echoed across the cold night air. The first Noel. The two melodies intertwined, one in German, one in English, rising above the ruined earth like a fragile prayer. By midnight, men were shouting greetings across the lines. They called out jokes, names of cities, even football teams. "Do you have any whiskey, Tommy?" "Yes." "And you, Fritz?" "Ja." "Come over." And then, something unthinkable happened. A few soldiers climbed out of their trenches. One German, waving a lantern, raised his arms to show he was unarmed. The British aimed their rifles but did not fire. Slowly, cautiously, a British private climbed out as well. The two men met in the middle of no man's land. They shook hands. The truce had begun. At dawn on Christmas morning, the scene defied belief. Men who had spent months trying to kill each other now stood side by side. They exchanged cigarettes, buttons, and photographs. Some shared tins of plum pudding and sausages. Others traded wine for tobacco. A British corporal wrote later, "I met a German who had lived in London. He showed me pictures of his family, and I showed him mine. There was no hate, only exhaustion and a strange kind of understanding." Soon hundreds joined in. The no man's land that had been a killing field became a meeting ground. They buried their dead, sometimes together. British and German soldiers laid to rest in the same shallow graves. They built wooden crosses, carved names, and sang hymns as they worked. A British chaplain held a short service, and German soldiers stood silently, heads bowed. For a few hours the war had stopped. One of the most famous moments of that day came in the form of a football match. No one knows exactly where or how it started. Some say near the village of Frelinghien, others near Ploegsteert. But witnesses agreed. A ball was produced and men began to play. Rifles served as goalposts, helmets as markers, and laughter replaced gunfire. It was not an organized game, more like a joyful chaos in the snow. The British claimed they won 3-2. The Germans disagreed. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was the happiest day anyone had seen in months. News of the truce spread quickly along the front. Not every sector participated. In some areas, the fighting continued as usual. But across dozens of miles, from the Isère to the Somme, tens of thousands of soldiers refused to fight. They shared music, warmth, and words that transcended orders. Many officers were uneasy, fearing that this brotherhood would undermine discipline. In some cases, high command tried to suppress it. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien warned, "Such fraternization is absolutely forbidden and will be met with severe punishment." But on the front lines, the men didn't care. For them, the truce was not rebellion, it was survival. It was proof that, beneath the mud and propaganda, they were still human. As night fell on December 25th, the men returned slowly to their trenches. They promised not to fire the next day. But they all knew the war would resume soon. Before leaving, some exchanged addresses, vowing to write after the war. Others carved messages into the wooden beams of the trenches. "Merry Christmas, 1914. Peace be with you, Fritz." When the first shots were fired again on December 26th, it felt almost sacrilegious. The sound of machine guns shattered the fragile peace they had built. A British soldier later wrote, "It was as if the world had woken from a dream. A beautiful dream we would never see again." The Christmas truce would never be repeated on that scale. As the war dragged on and bitterness deepened, such moments became impossible. By 1916, gas, tanks, and total destruction had erased the last illusions of chivalry. The generals learned from 1914 and made sure that soldiers would never fraternize again. But memory is stubborn. Even as the war consumed millions, the story of that single day spread across Europe. Letters smuggled home described scenes of peace amid slaughter. When they were published in newspapers, readers could scarcely believe them. In Britain, the idea that their sons had sung with the enemy seemed both heartwarming and scandalous. In Germany, censors tried to bury the story, but it could not be erased. It became a quiet legend, whispered proof that even in the darkest of times, compassion could still break through. Decades later, survivors of the Western Front would speak of it with tears in their eyes. To them, the Christmas truce was not about politics or victory. It was about memory, about the fleeting moment when men remembered who they were. It was a human rebellion against the madness of war. By the end of World War I, over 16 million people were dead. Cities were in ruins, empires shattered, and a generation lost. But among the endless stories of horror, the truce stood apart, a fragile miracle that defied logic. It reminded the world that beneath the uniforms and flags, there were men, sons, fathers, brothers, all yearning for the same thing: peace. Even today, historians still debate how widespread the truce was, how spontaneous, how genuine. But its truth is not measured in numbers. It lives in the letters written home that night, in the photographs of smiling soldiers standing side by side, in the carols sung across enemy lines. It lives in the idea that humanity can flicker even when surrounded by darkness. As one soldier wrote home, "I would not have missed that Christmas day for anything in the world." And so the story endures. When the world seems divided beyond repair, when hatred feels unstoppable, the Christmas truce reminds us that peace is always possible, if only for a moment. For on that cold, starry night in 1914, amid the trenches of Flanders, the guns fell silent, and enemies became brothers.